You don't belong in this meeting. Richard Harlan's voice hit the hallway like a slammed steel door, sharp enough to stop every conversation on the executive floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center. At exactly 6:42 p.m., nurses froze beside rolling medication carts. Two residents near the elevator stopped mid-sentence. Even the quiet hum of fluorescent lights suddenly felt louder. Dr. Camille Whitaker didn't blink. She stood there in a charcoal gray coat, simple black slacks, and low heels still damp from the rain outside, looking less like the billionaire CEO of Whitaker Health Systems and more like a tired woman arriving after a 14-hour day. That was the problem. Richard Harlan had already decided what power looked like. And to him, it did not look like a black woman standing calmly outside a boardroom without an entourage. This floor is restricted to hospital leadership, Richard continued, stepping in front of the conference room doors with both hands clasped behind his back. His silver cufflinks flashed beneath the cold overhead lights. Family visitation ends downstairs. A few executives nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody corrected him. Nobody moved. Camille slowly looked past him through the glass walls of the boardroom. 12 seats. 12 white faces. 12 people preparing to approve another round of budget cuts that would shut down 2 low-income clinics before winter. She had read every report on the drive over. Every manipulated number. Every buried complaint. Every ignored lawsuit connected to discriminatory patient treatment. Tonight was supposed to confirm whether the corruption inside St. Gabriel ran deeper than rumors. Now she had her answer before even opening the door. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Camille. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her the way people inspect counterfeit money. Can I help you find security? He asked. The insult landed softly, but it spread through the hallway like smoke. Camille had heard that tone before. At 23, she heard it when a hospital administrator assumed she was janitorial staff during her residency. At 31, she heard it when an investor asked if she was the diversity hire at her own healthcare startup presentation. And now, 20 years later, here it was again. Different building. Same poison. Camille finally spoke, her voice calm enough to make Richard's confidence flicker for the first time. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Margaret Sloan, the hospital's CFO, stepped out from the boardroom carrying a tablet against her chest. Blonde hair perfect. Smile rehearsed. Richard, is there a problem? She asked quietly, though loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Richard didn't take his eyes off Camille. Just someone confused about where she belongs. A resident near the elevator lowered his gaze immediately. One nurse bit her lip hard enough to turn pale. The hallway wasn't loud anymore. It was charged. Camille reached into her coat pocket and removed her phone. No anger. No raised voice. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that made people nervous because it looked too controlled to be weakness. Richard noticed the phone and smirked. If you're planning to record us for social media, he said, legal will deal with that. Camille looked directly at him then. Her eyes never hardened. They didn't need to. No, she replied softly. I'm deciding how many people lose their jobs tonight. Silence swallowed the hallway whole. Richard Harlan laughed once under his breath, but it sounded forced now, thin around the edges like paper beginning to tear. The executives behind the glass conference walls had stopped pretending not to watch. Margaret Sloan shifted her tablet tighter against her chest. Peter Caldwell, the hospital's chief medical officer, slowly removed his glasses as if he suddenly needed a clearer look at the woman standing in the hallway. Camille Whitaker remained perfectly still beneath the cold white lights of the executive floor. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, turning the city into a blur of silver and red brake lights 30 stories below. That is a serious statement, Margaret finally said carefully. Especially from someone who does not appear on tonight's leadership schedule. Camille slid her phone back into her coat pocket. Schedules can be edited, she replied. Ownership cannot. Richard smirked immediately, recovering just enough arrogance to keep performing for the room. There it is, he said loudly. Every week somebody claims they know the owner, the board, legal counsel. This hospital is not some social media fantasy where you walk in and demand authority. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You are embarrassing yourself. Camille did not move backward. that seemed to bother him more than anger would have. Across the hallway, a young nurse standing beside the nurse's station glanced toward Camille again. Her badge read Jasmine Reed, 26 years old, third-year trauma nurse. She looked nervous before she looked brave. Her eyes flicked between Camille and the executive roster glowing on a nearby monitor. Something about the name had landed in her memory. Richard noticed her hesitation instantly. "Jasmine," he snapped. "Get back to your station." The nurse flinched slightly, but stayed where she was. Camille noticed that too. Fear inside hospitals moved differently. Quiet. Professional. Buried under smiles and clipped voices. But it was still fear. Peter Caldwell finally stepped out from the boardroom. Expensive loafers silent against polished tile. "Ma'am," he began with rehearsed patience. "This floor handles sensitive executive matters involving patient care strategy and legal compliance. If you have concerns, guest relations downstairs can assist you." Camille looked directly at him. "Guest relations cannot explain why minority patient complaints disappear from your quarterly reports." The hallway tightened instantly. Peter's expression froze. Margaret looked at Richard sharply. Somebody near the elevators whispered, "What did she say?" Camille continued before anyone could interrupt. 83 unresolved complaints in 11 months. 7 families threatened legal action. 3 physicians resigned quietly after internal investigations vanished. Richard's jaw hardened. "You have absolutely no right accessing confidential hospital records." Camille tilted her head slightly. "That is interesting. You are more upset about someone reading the reports than the reports existing." For the first time, nobody answered immediately. The air itself seemed to hesitate. Jasmine slowly stepped closer to the executive monitor mounted near the wall. Her fingers moved across the touchscreen carefully. Richard saw it too late. The screen shifted. Executive ownership structure. Whitaker Health Systems. Parent organization. Majority stakeholder. Jasmine's eyes widened first. Then her face lost color completely. "Oh my God," she whispered before she could stop herself. Richard turned sharply. "What are you doing?" Jasmine looked directly at Camille now, panic and realization colliding in her expression. "Her name," she said softly. "Her name is on the foundation records." Silence hit harder this time. Margaret lowered her tablet slightly. Peter stopped breathing long enough for it to show. Richard stared at the screen, then at Camille, then back again as if refusing to trust his own eyes. But Camille only stood there calmly while the storm finally started catching up to them. Richard Harlan recovered first, or at least pretended to. Men like him had spent entire careers believing confidence could overpower facts if spoken loudly enough. He straightened his navy suit jacket slowly and forced a dry smile across his face. "That does not prove anything," he said, gesturing sharply toward the monitor. "Large organizations have thousands of names attached to filings and donor records." Jasmine Reed swallowed hard. "No, sir," she replied carefully. "This is not a donor page." Her fingers trembled slightly against the touchscreen. "This is ownership hierarchy." Margaret Sloan stepped forward quickly. "Jasmine, step away from the monitor." The young nurse hesitated. Camille watched all of it silently. Every shifting eye, every nervous inhale, every executive suddenly calculating how much trouble had just walked onto their floor wearing rain-soaked heels and no visible security team. Peter Caldwell cleared his throat. "Even if there is some connection here," he said cautiously, "that still does not justify unauthorized access to executive meetings." Camille finally looked at the boardroom doors again. Frosted glass, gold lettering, board of directors. The same room where they had approved millions in bonuses while emergency room staffing shortages nearly doubled overnight wait times on Chicago's South Side. "Interesting," Camille said softly. "You are still trying to decide whether I belong here instead of asking why your nurses are afraid of you." Nobody liked that sentence. It landed too close to truth. Jasmine lowered her eyes immediately. Richard noticed it too. "Enough," he snapped. "Jasmine, return downstairs before I call your supervisor myself." The nurse froze completely this time. Camille saw fear spread across her face the way cold spreads through glass. Professional fear. The kind that keeps people silent because rent is due Friday morning. Richard turned back toward Camille, voice colder now. "You are disrupting hospital operations. If you refuse to leave voluntarily, security will escort you off the executive floor." Margaret nodded quickly beside him, relieved to hear authority return to familiar ground. "This has gone far enough." Camille folded her hands calmly in front of her. No, she replied. It has not gone far enough yet. Rain thundered harder against the windows behind them. The city lights flickered across polished marble floors while nurses farther down the hallway quietly slowed their pace just to keep listening. Word was spreading floor by floor. A black woman had walked into executive territory and refused to shrink. Richard pulled out his phone immediately. Security to level 30, he said sharply into the receiver. We have a non-compliant individual interfering with hospital administration. The phrase echoed down the hallway. Non-compliant individual. Camille almost smiled hearing it. Hospitals loved clean language for ugly behavior. Peter shifted uneasily. Richard, he muttered quietly. Maybe we should verify this before escalating further. Richard spun toward him instantly. Verify what? That someone wandered upstairs pretending to own a hospital? Camille spoke before Peter could answer. Not the hospital, she corrected calmly. The network. Silence hit again. Margaret's face tightened. Whitaker Health Systems did not own one hospital. It controlled 14 across 3 states. $2 billion in annual healthcare operations. Hundreds of executive contracts. Thousands of careers. Richard's expression flickered for half a second before arrogance rushed back to cover it. If you had that kind of authority, he scoffed, you would not be standing here dressed like this. That sentence changed the hallway. Even Peter looked uncomfortable after hearing it. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, like she already knew tomorrow morning would feel different inside this building. Camille took one slow step closer to Richard now. Calm. Controlled. Unshaken. You still think power only wears expensive suits and pale skin, she said quietly. That is why tonight is going to hurt so much. At the far end of the hallway, elevator doors opened with a soft chime. 2 hospital security officers stepped out onto the executive floor. The 2 security officers stepped onto the executive floor with the stiff posture of men expecting trouble, but not yet understanding what kind. One was tall and broad-shouldered with tired eyes behind wire-frame glasses. His badge read Daniel Mercer. The other, younger, sharper around the jaw, kept one hand near his radio as he approached. Rainwater still glistened across the polished windows behind Camille Whitaker while the executive hallway held its breath. Richard Harlan pointed toward her immediately. Escort her downstairs, he ordered. She is trespassing and interfering with board operations. Daniel Mercer slowed instead of rushing forward. That hesitation irritated Richard instantly. Did you hear me? Daniel looked at Camille carefully. Calm posture. No raised voice. No panic. No aggression. Just a woman standing still while half the executive floor seemed determined to erase her authority by force of assumption alone. Ma'am, Daniel said professionally. Can you identify yourself? Before Camille could answer, Richard cut in sharply. She already gave us a fake ownership story. Jasmine. Reed suddenly spoke up from beside the monitor. It was not fake. Every head turned toward her. The young nurse looked terrified saying it, but she kept going anyway. I checked the executive registry myself. Margaret Sloan snapped immediately. Jasmine, you are dangerously out of line. Jasmine swallowed hard. No, ma'am. I think all of you are. Silence spread again, deeper now. The younger security officer glanced toward the ownership screen still glowing beside the nurse's station. Whitaker Health Systems remained displayed in clean white letters against a blue corporate background. Majority Control Authority. Richard stepped directly in front of the screen, as if his body alone could block reality. That system is internal, he barked. She could have manipulated it somehow. Camille finally exhaled slowly through her nose. You run a billion-dollar medical institution, she said quietly, and your first instinct is still that the black woman standing in front of you must be the fraud. Richard's face hardened instantly. Do not twist this into racism. Camille tilted her head slightly. I did not have to. The younger security officer shifted uncomfortably. Nurses farther down the hall had stopped pretending to work altogether now. A respiratory therapist stood frozen beside a supply cart listening openly. 2 interns near the elevators exchanged uneasy looks. The story was spreading through the building faster than Richard realized. Daniel Mercer finally stepped closer to Camille, lowering his voice respectfully. Ma'am, if there is a misunderstanding here, maybe we should move this conversation somewhere private. Camille looked directly at him. There was an opportunity for privacy before your executives decided humiliation was hospital policy. That sentence landed hard enough to make Margaret look away. Richard pulled at his cufflinks again, irritation bleeding into desperation now. This woman walked onto a restricted floor accusing leadership of corruption. Camille answered immediately, not accusing. Her eyes moved across each executive face one by one, confirming. Peter Caldwell rubbed a hand across his forehead. Sweat had begun collecting beneath his collar despite the cold air conditioning running through the hallway vents. Richard, he muttered quietly, we need legal involved immediately. Richard ignored him. Daniel, he snapped toward security, remove her now. But Daniel Mercer did not move. Instead, he asked the question nobody else had wanted to ask out loud. Ma'am, he said carefully, are you Dr. Camille Whitaker? The hallway went still enough to hear the distant beeping of cardiac monitors 3 floors below. Camille met his eyes calmly. Yes. The younger officer's posture changed first. Straightened shoulders. Immediate recognition. Daniel's expression followed 1 second later. The exact second reality finally caught up with the room. Richard noticed both reactions, and for the first time since Camille arrived, genuine fear touched his face. Small, fast, but visible. Jasmine Reed looked like she might stop breathing altogether. Margaret's tablet slipped slightly in her hands. Peter whispered one stunned word under his breath. Jesus. Camille remained perfectly composed while the hallway around her quietly collapsed. Richard Harlan's face drained slowly, like the building itself had pulled the color out of him. But pride is a dangerous thing when humiliation arrives in public. Instead of backing down, he doubled down. That is impossible, he said sharply, almost too quickly. Dr. Whitaker would never walk in here alone looking like this. The sentence hung in the hallway like poison released into clean air. Daniel Mercer stared at him in disbelief. Margaret Sloan closed her eyes briefly as if she could already hear lawyers speaking tomorrow morning. Camille Whitaker remained motionless. Calm had become its own kind of pressure now. You still think leadership has a dress code attached to skin color, she said quietly. Richard ignored her completely and turned toward security again. I want her escorted downstairs until legal verifies identity and authorization. Peter Caldwell looked horrified. Richard, he whispered, stop talking. But Richard could not stop. Men who spend years protected by titles rarely notice the exact moment authority becomes self-destruction. The younger security officer took a cautious step back instead of forward. Daniel Mercer cleared his throat. Sir, if this is Dr. Whitaker, we cannot remove her from her own executive floor. Richard snapped instantly. Then verify it. Camille slowly reached into her coat pocket again. Every eye followed the movement. Nurses, executives, security, interns pretending not to stare. She removed a slim black phone and unlocked it calmly. No shaking hands. No anger. Just precision. Monica, she said softly once the line connected. A woman's voice answered immediately through speakerphone. Crisp. Professional. Good evening, Dr. Whitaker. The hallway tightened again. Richard's confidence flickered. I need executive verification for St. Gabriel Medical Center, Camille continued. Full board authorization. Already prepared, Monica replied. Would you like Nightfall review activated? Margaret's face changed first. Real fear this time. Peter whispered, oh no. Richard frowned. What is Nightfall review? Camille looked directly at him. The protocol reserved for executive misconduct investigations. Silence crashed into the hallway hard enough to feel physical. Rain hammered the windows harder now, while thunder rolled faintly over downtown Chicago. Monica continued speaking through the phone. Current board members under review include Richard Harlan, Margaret Sloan, Peter Caldwell, and 6 additional executives connected to unresolved discrimination complaints and patient negligence audits. Jasmine Reed covered her mouth immediately. The younger security officer looked away awkwardly. Daniel Mercer stared directly at Richard now instead of Camille. Richard laughed suddenly, but the sound cracked apart halfway through. This is intimidation, he said. You cannot walk in here making accusations without evidence. Camille's expression did not change. I brought evidence before I brought myself. That sentence landed deep. Too deep. Peter leaned heavily against the wall now, sweat visible beneath the fluorescent lights. Margaret gripped her tablet so tightly her knuckles lost color. Camille looked beyond them for a moment toward the intensive care wing visible down the far corridor. And suddenly another hallway appeared in her memory. 27 years earlier. Her mother sitting under flickering emergency room lights with one hand pressed against her chest. Waiting 3 hours while patients arriving later were treated first. Camille had been 14 years old, wearing a faded church sweater and holding insurance papers nobody bothered reading. She still remembered the nurse who finally sighed and said, "People like them always think it is an emergency." Her mother survived that night. Another woman in the waiting room did not. Camille carried that memory into every hospital she built afterward. Not anger. Standards. She returned her attention to Richard slowly. "You asked why I came alone," she said quietly. "Because I needed to see whether this institution was sick from the inside." Richard's jaw tightened, and Camille's eyes hardened for the first time all night. Now I know. The executive floor no longer felt like a hospital hallway. It felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Nobody moved quickly anymore. Nobody spoke casually. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while rain streaked down the windows behind Camille Whitaker in long silver lines. Richard Harlan stood rigid near the boardroom entrance, trying to hold together authority that was slipping through his hands one sentence at a time. Monica's voice still echoed faintly through Camille's phone speaker. "Nightfall review is now active," she confirmed. "All executive communications are being archived. Internal compliance teams have been notified." Margaret Sloane's face tightened immediately. "You cannot activate a corporate review without board consent." Camille looked at her calmly. "I just did." Daniel Mercer took another step backward from the executives now instead of toward Camille. Even security understood the balance of power had shifted. Peter Caldwell rubbed both hands across his face slowly. "Richard," he whispered, "this is catastrophic." Richard ignored him again. Pride had become panic now, and panic makes people reckless. "You think you can intimidate everyone with corporate language and legal threats?" He snapped toward Camille. "This hospital was functioning perfectly before you walked in here, creating chaos." Camille's expression never changed. A hospital is not functioning perfectly when patients are treated differently based on race, insurance status, or appearance. Jasmine Reed looked down at the floor after hearing that. The silence around her said enough. Monica's voice returned through the phone. "Dr. Whitaker, compliance has already recovered deleted complaint reports from St. Gabriel servers." Margaret's head jerked upward instantly. Peter went pale. Richard's jaw hardened. "Deleted?" Camille asked softly. 34 files archived off record within the last 6 months, Monica continued. "Most connected to emergency care disputes involving minority patients." Daniel Mercer slowly turned toward Richard now, stunned. The younger security officer removed his hand from his radio completely. Nobody looked comfortable anymore except Camille. That was the unsettling part. The woman they tried to humiliate was now the calmest person in the building. Richard pointed toward the phone angrily. "This is selective reporting. Every hospital deals with complaints." Camille nodded once. "True." Her eyes locked onto his. "Most hospitals do not erase them." The hallway tightened again. Peter leaned against the wall harder now, breathing shallow. Margaret stared at the ownership monitor like she wished the screen would disappear. Nurses farther down the corridor had openly stopped working for a moment just to listen. One resident quietly whispered, "This place is finished." Camille heard it. So did Richard. "No." Richard snapped immediately. "What is finished is this ridiculous performance." He stepped closer toward Camille, lowering his voice into something colder. "People like you walk into institutions like this and immediately assume racism every time someone challenges you." That sentence changed the air completely. Even Margaret looked shocked hearing it out loud. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly like she had heard versions of that sentence her entire career. Camille remained perfectly still, but something inside her expression sharpened. Not rage. Recognition. "No," she said quietly. "People like me recognize racism because we survive it." Thunder rolled low across the Chicago skyline outside the windows. Monica spoke again through the speakerphone. "Dr. Whitaker, legal review also flagged irregular executive bonuses approved during staffing shortages." Peter whispered a curse under his breath. Margaret finally lost composure. "Richard, stop talking," she hissed. "You are making this worse." But Richard was already unraveling publicly. "She came here looking for a reason to tear this place apart." Camille looked directly into his eyes. "No," she replied softly. "I came here hoping I was wrong." That sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Because deep down, Every person standing there suddenly understood the same terrifying truth. She had not arrived angry. She had arrived disappointed. The hallway stayed silent after Camille Whitaker's last sentence, but it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence people fall into when truth finally becomes impossible to avoid. Rain rolled against the windows in heavy sheets while distant ambulance sirens echoed somewhere below the 30-story tower. Richard Harlan looked around the executive floor like a man searching for support that had already left the room. Nobody stepped beside him now. Not Margaret. Not Peter. Not even security. Monica's voice came through the phone again, calm and efficient. Dr. Whitaker, legal counsel, has joined the Nightfall review. Executive access logs are being frozen system-wide. Margaret's tablet suddenly chimed in her hands. She looked down instantly. Her face lost color. "My credentials," she whispered. Peter checked his own phone next. Same result. Access restricted pending review. Richard grabbed his device aggressively and tapped across the screen. Error messages flashed back at him. His jaw tightened harder with every failed attempt. Camille watched quietly. "You locked us out?" Margaret asked, stunned. Camille nodded once. "No executive under investigation keeps unrestricted authority." The hallway shifted again. Nurses farther down the corridor exchanged wide-eyed glances. Daniel Mercer folded his hands in front of him now instead of reaching for his radio. Even the younger officer seemed unable to look directly at Richard anymore. The balance of power had flipped completely. Richard noticed it too. That terrified him more than the audit. "This is insane," he snapped suddenly. "You cannot publicly humiliate your own board like this." Camille's eyes finally hardened fully. "You publicly humiliated patients for years." The words hit like cold steel. Nobody defended him. Nobody could. Jasmine Reed slowly stepped away from the monitor and looked toward Camille with something close to disbelief. "You already knew," she said quietly. Camille glanced at her. "I suspected." Jasmine shook her head faintly. "Then why come here alone?" For the first time all night, Camille paused before answering. The hallway waited with her. "Because people reveal themselves differently when they think nobody important is watching." Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. "So this was a trap." Camille turned toward him slowly. No, her voice stayed low. Controlled. Dangerous because of how calm it remained. "A trap is unfair. I gave every one of you an opportunity to show basic dignity." Thunder rolled again outside the windows. Margaret lowered herself carefully into a chair near the wall, like her knees no longer trusted her. Peter stared at the floor. Richard alone kept trying to fight reality. "You are destroying careers over misunderstandings." Camille stepped closer now. Not aggressive. Certain. "No, Richard." Her eyes locked onto his. "I am ending careers built on abuse." Silence swallowed the hallway whole. Monica spoke again through the speakerphone. "Dr. Whitaker, the emergency board session is ready. Replacement candidates are standing by for vote authorization." Peter looked up sharply. "Replacement?" Margaret's breathing visibly changed. Richard stared at Camille like he had finally understood the size of the storm standing in front of him. Camille looked directly at the boardroom doors behind him. Gold lettering. Frosted glass. Authority built on polished appearances and hidden damage. Then she spoke the sentence that split the night in half. "You blocked me from entering a hospital my company owns," she said. Quietly. "And now you are about to learn the difference between authority and ownership." Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out this time. Because somewhere deep down, he finally understood the truth. The woman he dismissed as unimportant had never needed their permission to belong there. She had been the most powerful person in the building since the moment the elevator doors opened. Richard Harlan looked smaller now. Not physically, spiritually. The kind of shrinking that happens when power leaves a person faster than pride can follow it. Rain continued hammering against the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, while the executive floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center stood frozen around Camille Whitaker like witnesses inside a collapsing empire. Monica's voice remained steady through the speakerphone. "Dr. Whitaker, the emergency governance panel is awaiting final authorization." Camille glanced toward the boardroom doors one last time before stepping forward. This time nobody blocked her path. Richard moved aside without realizing he had done it. That was the moment the hallway truly changed. Camille pushed open the glass doors calmly and entered the boardroom. The long walnut conference table stretched beneath recessed lighting polished enough to reflect nervous faces. Screens along the walls still displayed quarterly growth projections and expansion plans nobody cared about anymore. One by one, executives already seated around the table began checking their phones in confusion. Access suspended. Credentials frozen. Review pending. The messages spread around the room like infection. Camille walked to the head of the table slowly, setting her phone beside a leather portfolio left behind by someone too shaken to grab it. "Good evening," she said quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Margaret Sloane entered behind her first, pale and silent. Peter Caldwell followed with the exhausted posture of a man already preparing resignation statements in his head. Richard came last, still angry, still trying to carry authority already stripped away from him. Monica's voice filled the room through the speakerphone. Executive Governance Review officially active. As of 7:26 p.m. Central Time, several board members exchanged alarmed looks. One older executive adjusted his tie nervously. "Camille," he began carefully. "Surely this can be discussed privately before formal escalation." Camille looked directly at him. "Patients did not receive private humiliation. Neither will this board." Silence again. Sharp. Uncomfortable. Deserved. Jasmine Reed stood quietly near the doorway beside Daniel Mercer and two nurses who had drifted closer during the chaos. None of them looked away anymore. Richard suddenly slammed both hands against the conference table hard enough to rattle water glasses. "This is retaliation," he snapped. "You came here looking for targets." Camille remained perfectly composed. "No," she answered softly. "I came looking for leadership." That sentence hollowed the room out. Monica continued speaking. Board review findings include discriminatory patient complaint suppression, unauthorized deletion of compliance reports, executive retaliation against staff concerns, and improper allocation of emergency staffing funds. Several executives visibly froze hearing the list spoken aloud. Margaret lowered herself slowly into a chair like gravity had doubled. Peter stared at the table in silence. Richard laughed once bitterly. "And you think replacing everyone fixes this?" Camille's eyes settled on him calmly. "No. Accountability does." She picked up her phone again. "Monica." "Ready, Dr. Whitaker." Camille took a slow breath. The room waited with her. Nurses near the doorway. Security officers. Executives who suddenly understood they were no longer protected by titles or polished hallways or selective silence. Then Camille spoke clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. "Effective immediately, Richard Harlan is removed as chair of the medical board. Margaret Sloane and Peter Caldwell are suspended pending full investigation. Emergency replacement authority is now transferred to interim governance review." The room stopped breathing. Monica's keyboard clicks echoed faintly through the speakerphone. Then one by one, electronic badges around the room buzzed red. Richard checked his access card. Immediately. Denied. Margaret's tablet locked automatically in her hands. Peter closed his eyes completely. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued. The punishment was colder than anger. It was final. Camille looked around the table slowly. "You built a culture where appearance mattered more than humanity," she said quietly. "Tonight that culture ends." Outside the boardroom windows, lightning flashed across the Chicago skyline, while inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, an entire system of power collapsed without Camille Whitaker ever once raising her voice. The storm outside had started to fade by the time the last executive badge lost access. Rain still crawled down the glass walls of the boardroom, but the thunder had moved farther across the Chicago skyline, leaving behind a strange kind of quiet inside St. Gabriel Medical Center. Not peaceful quiet, cleansed quiet, the kind that comes after something rotten finally breaks apart in open air. Richard Harlan remained standing near the end of the conference table, staring at the red light flashing across his disabled access card. He looked like a man trying to remember where his authority had gone. Margaret Sloane sat motionless with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Peter Caldwell had not spoken in nearly 10 minutes. Around them, board members avoided eye contact entirely, suddenly fascinated by polished wood grain and dark computer screens. Camille Whitaker stood at the head of the table exactly where Richard once believed she did not belong. Calm, unmoved, certain. Monica's voice echoed softly through the speakerphone one final time. "Dr. Whitaker, interim governance transition is complete. Replacement board members will arrive by morning." Camille nodded once. "Thank you, Monica." "Always, Doctor." The call disconnected. Silence settled over the room again. Jasmine Reed remained near the doorway beside Daniel Mercer and several hospital staff members who had quietly gathered during the collapse. Their expressions had changed since the beginning of the night. Fear had turned into something else now. Relief. Richard finally spoke, but his voice no longer carried weight. You destroyed an entire board in one evening. Camille looked at him steadily. No, she answered softly. You destroyed it yourselves. I only stopped protecting it. Nobody argued with her this time, because deep down, they all knew the truth. This night had not started with Camille walking through the door. It started years earlier, every time someone ignored a complaint because the patient did not look important enough. Every time staff stayed silent to protect careers. Every time leadership chose reputation over humanity. Camille slowly walked toward the boardroom windows overlooking the city below. Ambulance lights flashed red and blue across rain-soaked streets 30 stories down. Somewhere in the building, a newborn cried faintly. Somewhere else, a family waited beside a hospital bed praying for good news. Real people, real fear, real trust placed into the hands of strangers wearing badges and titles. Camille folded her arms quietly. Hospitals are sacred places, she said without turning around. People arrive here scared, sick, vulnerable. They do not come asking whether leadership approves of their clothes or their skin color. Her reflection stared back at her through the rain-streaked glass. The moment dignity becomes selective inside a hospital, medicine stops being care and starts becoming power. Jasmine Reed felt tears gather in her eyes hearing that. Daniel Mercer lowered his gaze slowly. Even Margaret looked ashamed now. Camille finally turned back toward the room. Tonight was never about revenge. Her eyes moved across every face at the table. It was about standards. Richard looked down at the floor for the first time all evening. The hallway outside the boardroom had grown crowded now with nurses, interns, technicians, and late-shift staff quietly watching history move through the building without sirens or shouting. Camille walked toward the doorway calmly. Nobody blocked her path this time. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. As she passed Jasmine, the young nurse spoke softly. Thank you. Camille paused beside her for just a moment. Do not thank me, she replied gently. Help build something better after me. Then she stepped into the hallway and disappeared. Toward the elevators while the executive floor remained silent behind her. And in that silence, one truth settled permanently into the walls of St. Gabriel Medical Center. Camille Whitaker never raised her voice that night. She raised the standard.